The 220-pound man crossed the empty terminal in 12 strides and stopped 6 feet from the chair. The man in the chair did not look up. He turned a page of the folded newspaper on his knee. He read the next paragraph. He folded the paper in half. He set it down. Then he looked up at the chest first, at the hands second, at the face for less than a second, and he said one word. He said, "Yes." He had not been asked a question. The bigger man's right hand, which had not been fully closed since he had stood up 40 feet away, closed the rest of the way. It was 6 minutes past 5 in the morning at San Francisco International, an hour before the first flight to Los Angeles. There were 9 people in a row of plastic chairs that could have held 40. 8 of them were asleep, or pretending to be. The 9th was reading a paper on his knee and weighed 138 pounds, and the man standing over him weighed 82 pounds more, and had won 11 tournaments in the last 18 months, and was ranked in the top 3 on the national karate circuit, and had not lost a Kyomight match since 1965. He had crossed the terminal because he had recognized the smaller man from the side of the face. He had crossed it because he had wanted to be sure. He was sure now. He said, "You're Lee." The smaller man nodded once. He did not stand up. He did not extend his hand. He did not say his own name back. He nodded. The bigger man said, "I want to talk to you." The smaller man looked at him for a full second before he answered. He looked at the bigger man's right hand. He noted that the right hand, even closed, was not fully closed. The index finger and the thumb were tight, but the middle, ring, and small fingers stopped about halfway. He noted this without moving his eyes from the hand for more than the time it took to register it, and then his eyes went back up to the bigger man's chest. He said, "All right." He folded the newspaper one more time, into quarters. He slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He picked up a small leather briefcase from between his feet by its handle. He stood up. Standing, he was 8 inches shorter than the bigger man. The bigger man, looking down at him now from that 8 inches, registered for the first time, in his body and not in his head, that something about the smaller man standing was not the same as his sitting. The standing did not change his size. It changed the way the space around him sat. The smaller man, standing, had become the thing the bigger man had walked across the terminal to reach, and the bigger man understood, in a way he did not yet have words for, that the reach was now complete and the next moment was not going to be his to design. He did not have words for that. He said, "There's a hallway. Down past the restrooms. It's empty." The smaller man said, "Show me." That was the whole exchange. The bigger man turned. He walked. The smaller man walked behind him, 3 feet back, with the briefcase in his right hand and his left hand free, and his eyes on the back of the bigger man's neck, and his stride matched, step for step, to the bigger man's, so that the sound of the two of them walking across the terminal tile was the sound of one set of footsteps, slightly heavier than one man's footsteps would have been. There was one other person in the terminal who registered the two of them walking. He was a cleaner. He was running an industrial mop in long slow arcs across the tile between the row of plastic chairs and the wall of windows that looked out onto the runway. He had been working that section of the terminal since 4:30 in the morning. He had not looked up when the bigger man stood. He had not looked up when the smaller man stood. He looked up now, when the two of them passed within 10 feet of him on their way to the corridor by the restrooms, because the change in the sound of footsteps had registered in the part of him that had been working night shifts in airports for 22 years and that paid attention to changes in the sound of footsteps without being told to. He watched them go. He went back to his mop. But he had stopped for 1 second. and in that second his eyes had gone first to the back of the bigger man, whom he recognized from the local sports section of the Chronicle, and second to the smaller man, whom he did not recognize at all, and third to the small leather briefcase in the smaller man's right hand, which he registered as the kind of briefcase a lawyer carries and which he could not, in that second, fit to the man carrying it. The cleaner's name was Henry Park. He was 48 years old. He had emigrated from Seoul in 1953, he had worked at the airport since 1955, and he had, in those 12 years, seen approximately 14 fights start in or near the terminal and approximately 11 of them get broken up before they finished. He had a sense for the shape of these things. He had registered, in the second he had looked up, that the shape of what was about to happen in the maintenance corridor by the restrooms was not the shape of a fight he had seen before. He registered it. He went back to mopping. He did not put the mop down for another 6 minutes. When he did put it down, 6 minutes later, it was because the smaller man had come back through the corridor alone, walking the same 3-foot interval he had walked going in, carrying the same small leather briefcase in his right hand, with his left hand still free, and the smaller man had stopped, for one moment, 2 feet from Henry Park's mop bucket, and had looked at Henry Park. He had not spoken. He had nodded once. He had walked past, and continued across the terminal, and sat back down in the same plastic chair he had been sitting in 11 minutes earlier, and he had taken the folded newspaper out of his inside jacket pocket, and he had unfolded it to the page he had been reading, and he had begun reading again from the next paragraph. The bigger man came out of the corridor about 90 seconds after the smaller man. He walked across the terminal without looking at the smaller man in the plastic chair. He walked out of the gate area entirely. He did not come back. Hold that. The smaller man is reading his paper. The bigger man is gone. The cleaner is standing with his hand on his mop. And there is, somewhere in the corridor by the restrooms, a sequence of about 4 seconds that ended a national-ranked karate fighter's competitive career 6 weeks before he knew it had ended. We're going to go into that corridor. But not yet. Because the story does not come to me from the corridor. It comes to me from a kitchen table in Seattle, in the spring of 1986, with a kettle on the stove and a man named Taky Kimura with his hands flat on the wood. My father drove up from Los Angeles that weekend. He brought a bottle of something Taky liked. They ate dinner. Taky's wife went to bed. Taky made coffee in a percolator that was older than I am, and he set 2 cups on the table, and he said, "There's one I haven't told you. I've been thinking about whether to tell you, and I've decided I will." My father did not write anything down. He had been raised to believe that taking notes in front of a man who was telling you a story was a way of telling the man that you did not trust your own memory, and he had never broken that habit. He listened. He drank the coffee. He went home Sunday night, and on Monday morning he wrote, on the back of a gas station receipt, 3 sentences he wanted to be sure he didn't lose. He put the receipt in a drawer. The receipt is in a drawer right now, in my house, 50 miles south of where Taky sat that night with his hands on the table. The receipt has 3 sentences on it. I'll tell you what they say at the end. What you need to know now is the chain. Because everything I'm about to tell you about the corridor, about what Bruce did, about what the bigger man saw, about the 4 seconds, comes through 4 people across 19 years, and the shape of it is the same in 3 independent versions, and that is the only reason I am willing to tell it at all. The first version is Taky's. Taky heard it from Bruce himself, the night Bruce flew back to Los Angeles, in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes, which Taky took standing in his kitchen in Seattle holding a dish towel and which he never wrote down. The second version is the bigger man's. He told it to one person, 6 years later, in a hotel bar in Las Vegas, and he made that person promise not to use his name, and the person kept the promise for the rest of his own life. The third version is Henry Park's. Henry told it, once, in 1982, to a stranger on a bench outside a coffee shop on Geary Boulevard, who happened to be my father's brother, who happened to be in San Francisco for a wedding, who happened to mention his brother in Los Angeles who spent a chunk of his life listening to a man named Taky tell stories about a man named Bruce. That's how Henry's version got to my uncle. My uncle told my father at Christmas dinner in 1983. My father drove up to Seattle 3 years later and asked Taky if any of it was true. That was the night Taky put his hands flat on the kitchen table and said, "There's one I haven't told you." So the story comes to me through 4 people, across 19 years, in 3 independent versions that did not know about each other. The bigger man did not know Henry Park existed. Henry Park did not know the bigger man's name until 1984. Taky did not know Henry Park existed at all, ever. And the 3 versions, when my father finally laid them next to each other on a kitchen table in Los Angeles in 1987, with a yellow legal pad and a black pen, matched on every single detail except 2. I'll tell you the 2 as we come to them. The bigger man's name was Frank Moretti. I am going to use his name in this video for reasons I'll explain near the end. He has been dead since 1998. The man he told the story to in Las Vegas has been dead since 2004. The promise Moretti extracted in that hotel bar has, in every sense that matters, expired. I am not the first person to write his name in connection with this story. A karate magazine printed it in 2009, 11 years after he died, in a paragraph that was 3 sentences long and that almost no one read. I am, as far as I can tell, the first person to write down what happened in the corridor. Moretti was 31 years old that morning in the terminal. He was 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, and he had been training in Shotokan karate since he was 15. He had a black belt under a Japanese instructor in San Jose whose name I am not going to use because the instructor's son is still alive and still teaching. He had won the U.S. Karate Association National Kyumai Championship in his weight class in 1966, and he had finished second in 1967, 4 months before the morning in the terminal. He was, by every measure that mattered in American karate in 1967, one of the 7 or 8 most dangerous men in the country in a sparring match. He was also, and this matters, polite. Everyone who knew Moretti said the same thing about him in interviews after he died. He was quiet. He did not drink at tournaments. He did not trash-talk opponents. He bowed correctly. He held doors. He was the kind of fighter that traditional Japanese instructors held up to younger students as an example of how an American could carry the art properly. He had a wife. He had a daughter who was 4 years old in October of 1967. He had a job selling commercial insurance in San Jose, because karate in 1967 did not pay anyone's rent. He had also, and this is the part that the Karate Magazine article in 2009 did not include, been telling people for about a year that he wanted to meet Bruce. He had not said meet in the sense of shake hands. He had said it in the other sense. He had been saying it in dojos in San Jose and Oakland and San Francisco, in the casual way men say things in dojos when they are warming down and the instructor is not in the room, and he had been saying it for long enough that several people had heard it, and one of those people, a brown belt who trained at a dojo in Japantown and who also happened to do part-time security at a club where Bruce had given a demonstration in early 1967, had passed it along. Not to Bruce directly. To a man who knew a man who taught at Bruce's school in Los Angeles. So Bruce, sitting in the plastic chair at 5:06 in the morning with the folded paper on his knee, when he had looked up at Frank Moretti standing 6 feet away and had said yes to a question that had not been asked. had said yes because he had known, for about 4 months, that Frank Moretti was looking for him. He had not gone looking for Moretti. He had not avoided him either. He had simply continued doing what he had been doing, teaching at the school on College Street in Los Angeles, flying up to Oakland to see James Lee, flying up to Seattle to see Taky, reading on planes, eating in diners, walking through terminals, and he had assumed, in the way you assume a thing when you have lived inside a certain kind of attention for a few years, that if Frank Moretti wanted to find him badly enough, Frank Moretti would find him. Frank Moretti had found him. And Bruce, looking up from his newspaper at 5 on a Tuesday morning in October at San Francisco International, had said yes. That is the first thing you need to know about what happened in the corridor. Bruce was not surprised. The second thing you need to know is what the briefcase was doing in his right hand. The briefcase, in all 3 versions of the story, is in the smaller man's right hand when he walks into the corridor and in the smaller man's right hand when he walks out. Henry Park, on the bench in 1982, told my uncle about the briefcase before he told him about anything else. The first sentence Henry said, after the part where he established that he had seen the 2 of them walk past his mop, was, "The small one was carrying a briefcase." He never put it down. Moretti, in the hotel bar in 1973, told the same thing. He said he had a bag in his right hand. The whole time. He never set it down. I didn't understand that until later. Taky said the same thing, on the kitchen table in 1986. Taky said, "Bruce told me he had the briefcase in his right hand the whole time. He said it was the most important detail." The briefcase contained a letter. The letter was from a man named Yip Man, who was Bruce's teacher in Hong Kong, and who was at that time 64 years old and living in a small apartment in Kowloon, and who had written to Bruce in September of 1967 in response to a letter Bruce had sent him in August. Bruce was flying to Los Angeles that Tuesday morning to show the letter to someone. I am not going to tell you yet who he was flying to show it to. That is the second of the 2 details where the 3 versions of the story do not match, and I want to be honest with you about that, and I will be honest with you about that, but not yet. What matters right now is that the letter was in the briefcase, and the briefcase was in Bruce's right hand, and Bruce was about to walk into a maintenance corridor at SFO with a man who outweighed him by 82 pounds and who had been telling people for a year that he wanted a piece of him, and Bruce did not, at any point in the next 6 minutes, transfer the briefcase to his left hand. Hold that detail. You'll need it. Because what Bruce did in the corridor, the one thing, the thing that took less than a second, the thing that Frank Moretti could not, 6 years later in a hotel bar in Las Vegas, point to the start of, he did with his right hand. The right hand that was holding the briefcase. We're going into the corridor now. But before we do one more thing, I want to tell you what Taky said about Bruce's face in the moment he looked up from the newspaper. Taky said Bruce told him, on the phone that night, that when he had heard Moretti's footsteps cross the terminal, he had finished the paragraph he was reading before he looked up. He said he had wanted to finish the paragraph because the paragraph was about a man in Indonesia who had lost his farm in a flood, and Bruce had wanted to know what happened to the man before he stopped reading. He said he had read the paragraph in about 11 seconds. He said the footsteps had stopped 6 feet away at about second 8. He said he had folded the paper at second 12. Taky said Bruce had told him, I wasn't making him wait. I was finishing the paragraph. Taky had asked, did he know that? Bruce had said, no. He thought I was making him wait. That was the first mistake. Taky said that on the phone, in 1967, that was the only thing Bruce said about Moretti the entire 11 minutes that sounded. To Taky's ear, like Bruce was assessing the man rather than describing what had happened. Taky said the rest of the call was just facts. Taky said the facts were these. He had said, he walked me to a corridor. I followed him. He stopped about 10 feet in. He turned around. He set his feet. He told me what he wanted. I told him no. He hit me. I moved. He hit again. I did one thing. He stopped. I told him to get up. He got up. I walked out. Taky said that was the whole version Bruce gave him on the phone. Taky said he had asked Bruce, what was the one thing? Bruce said, I'll show you next time I see you. Taky said, when's that? Bruce said, December. It was October 24th, 1967. Bruce flew up to Seattle on December 19th, 1967, and he stayed at Taky's house for 3 days, and on the second night, after dinner, in Taky's garage, with a single bare bulb on a chain hanging from the ceiling, Bruce showed Taky what he had done in the corridor. Taky stood in for Moretti. Taky was 5 feet 8 inches and weighed about 165 pounds, which was not 220 and not 6 feet 2 inches, but Taky understood what Bruce was showing him because Taky had been training with Bruce since 1959 and Taky's body understood what Bruce's body was doing in a way that did not require Moretti's exact dimensions to translate. Bruce showed it to him 3 times. Taky said the first time, he did not see it. He said the second time, he saw the end of it but not the start. He said the third time, he saw the whole thing, and he sat down on a wooden crate in the garage and he did not stand up for about 4 minutes, and Bruce stood under the bare bulb with his hands at his sides and waited, and finally Taky said, I need you to do it again. Bruce did it a 4th time. Taky said, on the kitchen table in 1986, that he had asked Bruce that night in the garage in 1967, how long did it take you to find that? Bruce had said, 9 years. Taky said he had asked, are you going to teach it? Bruce had said, I just did. That was the end of the conversation in the garage. 3 days later Bruce flew back to Los Angeles. 6 weeks after that, on the morning of January 31st, 1968, Frank Moretti walked into his instructor's office in San Jose at 7 a.m. with a cup of coffee that he was not drinking, and he sat down across from his instructor, and he said 3 sentences. The instructor wrote them down. The instructor's son still has the page. I'll tell you what the 3 sentences said when we come back to it. Right now we're going into the corridor. It is 6 minutes past 5 in the morning. The cleaner is at his mop. The 8 other people in the terminal are asleep. The smaller man is 3 feet behind the bigger man, with a briefcase in his right hand and his left hand free. The corridor is 10 feet ahead. Hold that. The corridor was concrete on 3 sides and tile on the 4th. It was a service corridor, the kind of corridor that runs behind the gate area of every airport in the world, that the public uses to find the restrooms and that the maintenance staff uses to move equipment, and that has, on one wall, a row of unmarked doors that lead to electrical rooms and storage closets and the small offices where the janitorial staff keeps their time cards. It was about 40 feet long and about 8 feet wide. There was a single fluorescent light at each end and one in the middle. The one in the middle was flickering. It had been flickering, according to Henry Park, for about 3 weeks, and the maintenance order to replace it had been filed twice and lost both times, and on the morning of October 24th, 1967, it was still flickering, at a rate of about once every 4 seconds, and the floor of the corridor in the middle 10 feet was lit in a way that pulsed. The bigger man walked 10 feet into the corridor. He stopped. He turned around. The smaller man stopped 3 feet behind him, which put him outside the bigger man's arm range by about 18 inches, which Henry Park noticed from the mouth of the corridor before he turned away and went back to his mop, and which Frank Moretti also noticed, in the moment he completed his turn, and which Frank Moretti registered as the first thing about the smaller man that did not match what he had been told. Moretti had been told that Bruce closed distance. Moretti had been told, by every man in every dojo who had described Bruce to him over the previous 12 months, that the small Chinese man's signature was that he came forward. That he moved into the space where the other man wanted to throw a strike, and he did it so fast that the strike either didn't start or didn't land, and that the entire system Bruce was building, whatever he was calling it that year, because he had been calling it different things, was a system organized around the principle that the man who arrived second arrived too late. Moretti had prepared for a man who would come forward. He was looking, now, at a man who had stopped 18 inches outside his range and who was standing with a briefcase in his right hand. This was the first thing that did not match. The second thing that did not match was the smaller man's feet. Moretti was a black belt in Shotokan. He had been reading other men's feet since he was 16 years old. He could tell you, by looking at a man's stance from across a dojo, whether the man was about to step in, step out, pivot left, pivot right, or hold. He read feet the way card players read hands. He looked at Bruce's feet. He could not read them. The feet were about shoulder width apart. The weight was on neither foot more than the other. The toes of the front foot were turned out by about 15 degrees. The toes of the back foot were turned out by about 30 degrees. The knees were soft. The hips were square. There was nothing about the stance that told Moretti where the next movement was going to come from, because there was nothing about the stance that committed to a direction. Moretti had a name for stances like that. He called them lazy. He had been taught, by his instructor in San Jose, that a lazy stance was the stance of a man who did not know what he was doing, and Moretti had built a career on punishing lazy stances, because the lazy stance was the stance of the man who had not yet decided, and the man who had not yet decided was the man who lost to the man who had. He looked at Bruce's lazy stance, and he made the mistake that he would, 6 years later in a hotel bar in Las Vegas, identify as the second mistake. He decided that the stance was lazy. He did not consider, in that moment, that the stance might not be lazy. He did not consider that the stance might be something else, a category of stance that did not exist in Shotokan, a stance organized around a principle that was not the principle of commitment to direction, a stance whose entire purpose was to remain undecided in a way that was not weakness but was, in fact, the precise opposite of weakness. He did not consider that, because he had not been trained to consider that. He had been trained to read feet. He read Bruce's feet, and he read them as lazy, and he set his own feet, front foot forward, back foot at 45 degrees, weight 60-40 on the back foot, knees bent, hips loaded, and he said, "I want to know if it's real." Bruce did not answer. Moretti said, "Everything I've heard. I want to know if any of it's real." Bruce did not answer. He shifted the briefcase slightly in his right hand. He did not transfer it to the left hand. He shifted his grip on the handle so that the briefcase was hanging at a slightly different angle from his right wrist, and the angle, when Moretti registered it half a second later, was the angle at which the briefcase would not interfere with a movement of the right arm. The right arm had not moved. The angle of the briefcase had. Moretti registered this and did not understand what he was registering. He understood, in the part of his training that had been built up over 15 years, that something about the smaller man's right side had just become more available than it had been 4 seconds earlier, but he could not have told you, in that moment, what specifically had changed. The right arm was still at the smaller man's side. The right hand was still on the briefcase handle. The shoulder had not rolled. The elbow had not lifted. The briefcase had moved 1 inch. Moretti, 6 years later in the hotel bar, would say, "He told me with the bag. I didn't read it." Bruce said, finally, "Show me what you want to show me." That was the sentence Taky reported on the phone that night. Taky was certain of the sentence. Taky said Bruce said it twice on the phone, both times in the same tone, both times with the same 6 words, and Taky said it was the only sentence in the call that had stayed in Taky's head for 30 years without effort. Moretti, in the hotel bar, reported a different sentence. Moretti said Bruce said, "Go ahead." 2 words. This is the first of the 2 details where the 3 versions of the story do not match. Henry Park, on the bench in 1982, did not report any words at all from inside the corridor, because Henry Park was at his mop 40 feet away and could not hear them, so the disagreement is between Taky's version, from Bruce, that night, and Moretti's version, from Moretti, 6 years later. I want to be honest with you about which one I believe. I believe Taky. I believe Taky because Taky was reporting what Bruce told him on a phone call 8 hours after it happened, and Moretti was reporting what he remembered 6 years and 700 conversations later, and because the sentence Taky reports, "Show me what you want to show me," is a sentence that fits the rest of the report and Moretti's 2-word version does not. Go ahead is the sentence a man gives when he has already decided to be hit. Show me what you want to show me is the sentence a man gives when he is telling the other man that the other man is about to reveal something the other man does not intend to reveal. Those are different sentences. They sound similar. They are not. Bruce, in Taky's version, was telling Moretti to begin, and was also telling Moretti, in the same 6 words, that the beginning was going to be the end of something Moretti did not yet know he was about to end. Moretti, in Moretti's version, was being given permission to attack. I think Moretti, 6 years later, remembered the sentence as the sentence he had heard rather than the sentence Bruce had said. I think he remembered the permission because the permission was the part that had stayed in his body. I think the rest of the sentence, the part about showing, had not stayed in his body, because his body had not, in the moment, been the part of him that was listening. So I'm going with Taky. Show me what you want to show me. Moretti heard it as go ahead. He went ahead. He stepped forward off the back foot, transferring the weight from 60-40 back to 70-30 front in a single small step that closed the distance between them from 42 inches to about 36, and his right hand came up off his hip in the chambered position that every Shotokan student in the world learns in the first 6 months, the fist at the hip, palm up, elbow tight to the ribs, and his right shoulder rolled, and his hips began to turn, and the strike that was coming was the strike. Frank Moretti had thrown approximately 40,000 times in 15 years. It was a reverse punch. Right hand, straight line, knuckles rotating from palm up to palm down through the trajectory, full hip commitment, breath sharp on the exhale through the teeth. The strike that had won him 11 tournaments in 18 months. The strike that he could land, from the position he was in approximately 0.3 of a second. It traveled the 36 inches between his hip and the spot where Bruce's solar plexus had been when the punch started. The spot was empty. Bruce had moved 4 inches. Not back. Forward. And to the right. He had moved into the punch and to the outside of it, a movement of about 4 inches diagonally, executed in the time it took Moretti's fist to travel the first 8 inches of its trajectory, which is to say, the movement was already complete before Moretti's elbow had finished extending, and the result was that Moretti's fully committed reverse punch passed through the air about 6 inches to the left of Bruce's ribs, and continued past, and locked his right shoulder forward in the position of a punch that had landed nothing. His hand was now in front of him. His weight was now on his front foot. His hips were now turned past square, rotated about 90 degrees to the right of where they had started. And Bruce was standing, with the briefcase still in his right hand, 4 inches diagonally from where he had been 1/3 of a second earlier, with his left side now positioned about 8 inches from Moretti's exposed right ribs. He had not struck. He had moved. Moretti froze. Not for long. Not in the sense that someone who was not a trained fighter would freeze. He froze for about 1/5 of a second, the time it took his nervous system to register that the punch had not landed and to begin the process of recovering the right shoulder back toward his centerline, and in that 1/5 of a second, Bruce did not strike. This is the part of the story that every version agrees on. Bruce did not strike on the first miss. He could have. Moretti, in the hotel bar in 1973, was emphatic about this. He said, "He had me. The first time. He had the shot. He didn't take it." The man in the hotel bar, whose name I'm not going to use because his widow asked me not to, and her reasons are her reasons, wrote down that night in a notebook he kept in his hotel room, M said the small one had the shot on the first miss. M said he didn't understand at the time why he didn't take it. M said he understood later. I asked him what he understood. M said he understood that the small one was giving him a chance to stop. Bruce was giving him a chance to stop. This is the third thing you need to know about Bruce in 1967, and it is the thing that does not fit any of the cinema-ready versions of who he was in that decade. Bruce, when he had a man dead to rights, did not always take the shot. He did sometimes. He had taken the shot on Wong Jackman in Oakland in 1964, though the details of that fight are disputed and I am not going to get into them in this video. He had taken the shot on the studio bouncer in Long Beach in 1965. He had taken the shot on several men over several years whose names are not worth getting into here. But he had also, on at least 3 occasions that I can document and probably more that I cannot, declined to take the shot on the first opening. He gave the man a chance to stop. The chance, in every case I know of, was not generous. It was diagnostic. It was Bruce saying, with his body, "I have just shown you that I have the shot. I am now going to wait 1/5 of a second. If you stop, this ends. If you don't stop, I will take the second shot, and the second shot will not be a chance." Moretti did not stop. He recovered the right shoulder back toward his centerline. He reset his feet, not all the way back to neutral, but enough to put him in a position to throw again, and his eyes, which had been fixed on the spot where Bruce's solar plexus had been before the first punch, now found Bruce's actual position, 4 inches diagonal from where they had been looking, and Moretti's brain processed, in the half-second after the miss, 3 pieces of information. 1. The small man had not moved back. 2. The small man had moved forward and to the outside. 3. The small man's hands were still at his sides. Moretti, in the hotel bar, said, "I had never thrown a punch into empty air before. Not against a real opponent. I had thrown into empty air in drills. I had never had a man not be where I had punched." The man with the notebook wrote down, M paused for about a minute here. He drank his beer. He said, "I thought I had punched too fast. I thought my own eyes had lied to me. I thought he was still in the original spot and I had pulled the punch by accident. I looked at him to confirm where he was. He was not where I had thought he was. He had moved. I had not seen him move. He had not seen him move. This is the thing. This is the thing that every version of the story, in slightly different words, ends up at. The movement Bruce made, the 4-inch diagonal step into and outside the punch, was a movement that should have been visible. 4 inches is not a small distance for the eye to track. A trained fighter, looking directly at his opponent, watches the opponent's center of mass continuously, and a 4-inch shift in the center of mass is a shift the trained fighter sees. Moretti had not seen it. He had been looking directly at Bruce. He had been looking at Bruce's solar plexus, the spot every Shotokan fighter is trained to look at, because the solar plexus is the geometric center of the body and the spot from which all other movement can be read, and the solar plexus had moved 4 inches, and Moretti had not registered the movement. He had registered, instead, the absence. He had registered, after the punch, that the solar plexus was not where it had been. He had not registered the trip from there to here. Moretti, in the hotel bar, said it was like he had been in 2 places. Not moved between them. Been in them. The man with the notebook wrote it down exactly that way. I do not know, and I am not going to pretend to know, what Bruce did in that step that made it invisible to a trained fighter looking directly at him. I have read, in the 40 years since I first heard this story, every book on Jeet Kune Do that has been published in English, and several articles on what Bruce called the broken rhythm, and several interviews with Bruce's students about what he taught them about timing, and I have my own theories, and my theories are not worth your time, because my theories are the theories of a man who has never thrown a fully committed punch at another man in his life. What I can tell you is what Bruce told Taky in the garage in Seattle 2 months later. Taky asked Bruce, in the garage, after the 3rd demonstration, "How did you make me not see it?" Bruce said, "I moved on his breath." Taky asked, "What does that mean?" Bruce said, "I moved on the part of his breath when his eyes were not working. He breathed in before he punched. He held the breath. When he started the punch, he started to let the breath out. The first eighth of a second of the exhale is the part of the breath when the eyes are not working. Most people don't know that. I move on that eighth of a second." Taky said, "How long did it take you to find that?" Bruce said, "I told you. 9 years. Taky said, "Can you teach it?" Bruce said, "I can teach the eighth of a second. I can't teach the 9 years." That was the conversation in the garage on the second night of Bruce's visit in December 1967. Taky reported it to my father in 1986. My father wrote it down not on the gas station receipt, but on a separate piece of paper, a yellow legal pad page that is in the same drawer as the receipt, and the words "I move on that eighth of a second" are written on that page in my father's handwriting, in black ink, underlined twice. My father underlined things twice when he believed them. He underlined the eighth of a second twice. I do not know if Bruce was telling Taky the literal truth about the mechanism of human vision during exhalation. I have looked into it. The research on saccadic suppression during respiration is real but contested. There is a thing that happens during certain phases of breathing where visual processing degrades very slightly. Whether the thing is eighth of a second specific, whether it correlates with exhalation onset, whether Bruce had figured out something the research community has not yet caught up to, or whether Bruce was using metaphor, I don't know. What I know is that Frank Moretti, who had been reading other men's feet since he was 16, did not see a 4-inch diagonal step that a man made directly in front of him in a well-lit corridor at 5 in the morning. He did not see it. He had to reconstruct, after the fact, where Bruce had gone. And in the moment he was doing that reconstruction, the half-second after the missed punch, he was not in a stance. He was in a recovery. And Bruce was 8 inches from his ribs. Bruce did not move. Bruce stood, with the briefcase in his right hand, 8 inches from Frank Moretti's exposed right side, and he watched Frank Moretti recover from a punch that had missed, and he did not move, and he did not strike, and after about 1 full second, which is a very long second in a fight, Frank Moretti completed his recovery, reset his feet, and brought his hands back up. Bruce said one sentence. Taky reported it. Moretti reported it. The two versions of the sentence match. This is one of the moments in the story where I am most confident of the words, because two independent sources, 20 years apart, in completely different contexts, reported the exact same 6 words. Bruce said, "You can stop now if you want." Moretti did not stop. Moretti, in the hotel bar in 1973, said, "I should have stopped. I knew I should have stopped. I had thrown my best punch and he hadn't been there. I should have bowed and walked out." The man with the notebook asked him, "Why didn't you?" Moretti said, "Because I had built 15 years on the idea that the best punch lands. If the best punch hadn't landed, I needed to throw it again. I needed it to land. I couldn't walk out of the corridor with the best punch in the air." Moretti reset his stance. He brought his hands back up. He breathed in. Bruce was watching the breath. "Hold that." He breathed in. Bruce was watching the breath. Moretti's chest rose by about 1.5 inches. His shoulders did not rise with it, because he had been trained, from the age of 15, to breathe from the diaphragm and to keep the shoulders quiet. The rise of the chest was the only external signal that the breath was happening, and the rise of the chest was, to a man who had been trained to read other men's bodies, almost imperceptible. Bruce saw it. He had been waiting for it. Moretti's hands were up. Right hand chambered at the hip again, he had reset to the same loaded position from which the first punch had come, because he was a fighter who, when something had not worked, threw it again with more commitment rather than throwing something else with less. Left hand forward at the center line, palm open, ready to parry or grab. Front foot forward, back foot at 45, weight 60 to 40 on the back. He had decided, in the half second after the first punch missed, that the first punch had missed because he had not committed hard enough. He was wrong about that. He was about to commit harder. This was the thing Moretti, 6 years later in the hotel bar, identified as the third mistake. He said, "I had 3 pieces of information." He had stepped diagonally. He hadn't struck when he could have. He had told me I could stop. All 3 pieces said the same thing. I read them as the opposite thing. The man with the notebook asked, "What did you read them as?" Moretti said, "I read them as him not being able to hit hard enough to make it count. I thought he had moved because he had to. I thought he hadn't struck because he didn't have the power. I thought he had offered me the stop because he was looking for a way out." The man with the notebook asked, "Did you really think that?" Moretti said, after a pause, "I needed to think that. I had already started the second punch in my head. I needed a story that let me throw it." He threw it. He came off the back foot at the same angle as before, but harder. The weight transfer was more violent. The hip turn was sharper. The right hand left the hip a quarter beat earlier in the breath cycle than the first punch had, because Moretti had decided, without articulating it, that the small man's diagonal step had worked the first time because Moretti's timing had been a hair slow, and he was going to correct for the hair this time by starting the strike fractionally earlier in the exhale. He started it on the breath. He started it on the 1/8 of a second that Bruce had been waiting for. Bruce had moved before Moretti's fist had left his hip. This is the part where the corridor became one thing and then it became another thing, and Moretti, 6 years later, could not point to the gap between them. The 4-inch diagonal step from the first punch had been a movement Moretti had failed to see. He had been looking, and his eyes had not processed the motion, and the result was that Bruce had ended up in a position Moretti could not account for. The movement Bruce made for the second punch was not the same kind of movement. It was not a step. It was a turn of the hip. Bruce's feet, which had been at shoulder width with the front toe out 15 and the back toe out 30, did not change position. The left foot did not move. The right foot did not move. The weight on the 2 feet did not redistribute. What moved was the pelvis. The pelvis rotated about 20 degrees to the right, around the central axis of the spine, in a motion so small and so contained that Moretti's eyes, which had been looking at Bruce's solar plexus, again, because Moretti had been trained to look at solar plexuses, registered no change in the position of the solar plexus. But the solar plexus had moved. Because when you rotate the pelvis 20 degrees, the entire torso above the pelvis rotates with it, and the solar plexus, which sits 2 inches below the sternum, moves laterally by about 3 inches. 3 inches. That was all the room Bruce needed. Moretti's second punch, which was a quarter beat faster and significantly harder than the first, traveled from his right hip toward the spot where Bruce's solar plexus had been before the hip turn. The spot was no longer occupied. The fist passed through air. The air was 3 inches to the left of where Bruce's solar plexus was now sitting. But the spot was not just empty. Because Bruce's hip turn had not only moved his torso 3 inches to the right. The hip turn had also opened the right side of Bruce's body, the side holding the briefcase, and it had done something to the right arm that Moretti, half a second later, would not be able to describe. Here is what Moretti said in the hotel bar. He said, his right arm came up. Not as a punch. I don't know what to call it. It came up and it was on my chest. I didn't see it leave his side. The man with the notebook asked, "What was the bag doing?" Moretti said, "The bag was still in his hand. He hit me with the hand the bag was in. The bag was still in it. This is the SR1 closing. You remember the briefcase. The small leather briefcase that Bruce had been carrying in his right hand since he had stood up from the plastic chair. The briefcase that he had not transferred to his left hand at any point in the 11 minutes between the terminal and this moment in the corridor. The briefcase that contained a letter from Yip Man. The briefcase was in his right hand when his right hand came up off his side and arrived on Frank Moretti's chest. It did not arrive as a punch. It arrived as an open palm. The fingers were spread. The wrist was relaxed. The handle of the briefcase was still in the curl of the index finger and the thumb. Those were the 2 fingers Moretti's right hand could not fully close, you remember. And now we're going to come back to that, but the rest of the hand was open, palm flat against the upper part of Moretti's sternum, about 2 inches below the collarbone. The palm was open. The arm was not extended. The elbow was bent. The shoulder was relaxed. It was not a strike. It was a placement. And then the hip turn, which had been rotating to the right for the last fifth of a second, continued. The hip turn had not stopped when the palm landed on Moretti's chest. The hip turn had used the palm as a contact point and it had kept going, transmitting the rotational force of Bruce's entire body weight, 138 pounds, turning around a vertical axis into the 3 square inches of Moretti's sternum where the palm was resting. Moretti, in the hotel bar, said, "I have been hit by everything. I have been hit by hammers in fights. I have been hit by feet harder than most men can punch. This was not a hit. This was a piece of the ground rising up." The man with the notebook wrote that down exactly that way. Moretti went off his feet. Not backward. He did not fly backward, the way men fly backward in movies. He went down and back, in a kind of collapsing arc, because the force of the hip turn through the palm had not been directed horizontally, it had been directed downward and through, into, and below his sternum, and his sternum had transmitted the force into his ribs, and his ribs had transmitted it into his spine, and his spine had transmitted it into his hips, and his hips, which had been loaded forward in the lunge of his missed punch, had been levered out from under him. He landed on his back. His right hand, which had been mid-punch, was still in the air. His right shoulder was still rotated forward. The punch, which had not landed, was still in the position of having not landed, frozen in the air above his chest, because the rest of his body had been removed from underneath the punch by Bruce's hip turn and the punch had not had time to retract. He lay on the concrete floor of the corridor, with the fluorescent light flickering above him at its 4-second rate, with his right hand still extended into the position of a punch that had no target, and he looked up. Bruce was standing where he had been standing. The hip turn had completed. Bruce's pelvis had returned, in the 3/5 of a second, back to its original square position. His feet had not moved at any point. His left hand was still at his side. The briefcase was still in his right hand, hanging at the same angle it had been hanging when Moretti had first turned around in the corridor. The right arm, the arm that had just placed an open palm on Moretti's sternum and transmitted 138 pounds of rotational body weight through it, was already back at Bruce's side. It had not stayed extended. It had not posed. It had not finished in any position that resembled a martial arts technique. It had returned to neutral. Bruce had not breathed out. This is the part that Moretti said he thought about for the rest of his life. Moretti said, in the hotel bar, I had thrown 2 full commitment punches with a full breath cycle each. He had moved twice, once with his feet, once with his hips, and he had hit me once, and he had not exhaled. I watched his chest. He had been holding the same breath the entire time. From before the first punch. The man with the notebook asked, how long had he been holding it? Moretti said, I don't know. Long enough that when I was on the floor, he still hadn't let it out. He was looking at me. He hadn't breathed. Moretti was on his back. His head was on the concrete. The back of his head had hit the floor when he landed, not hard, because Bruce's placement had not generated horizontal force, but hard enough that Moretti registered, in the moment after he landed, that there was a dull ache at the base of his skull and that the fluorescent light above him was flickering and that the air in the corridor smelled like industrial floor cleaner and that he could not, for a moment, remember which arm he had been punching with. His right hand came down out of the air. Slowly. Because the muscles in his shoulder that had been holding the punch in the air had received, from the part of his brain that managed posture, the signal that the punch was over. He looked up at Bruce. Bruce was looking down at him. Bruce was not smiling. This is something that Moretti was emphatic about in the hotel bar, and that Taky, in his version, also reported, and the 2 reports match. Bruce was not smiling. He was not gloating. He was not making the small triumphal face that fighters make when they have dropped an opponent. His face was the same face he had been wearing when he had looked up from the newspaper in the terminal 11 minutes earlier. It was a face that was paying attention. It was a face that had been paying attention for the entire 11 minutes, at the same level, without spike or relaxation, and the face had not changed in the moment Moretti had hit the floor, because for Bruce, the moment Moretti hit the floor was the same moment as all the other moments, a moment in which a thing was happening that required a certain kind of attention, and the attention was being given. Moretti said, I had expected him to look at me a certain way. I had imagined, walking across the terminal, how he would look at me when it was over. I had imagined 2 possibilities. One was he would look angry. One was he would look pleased. He looked like neither one. He looked like a doctor. The man with the notebook asked, "What do you mean a doctor?" Moretti said, "He looked like a doctor checking whether the medicine had worked." Then Bruce exhaled. It was a long exhale. It was the breath he had been holding from before the first punch, through the missed reverse, through the diagonal step, through the offered stop, through the second missed reverse, through the hip turn, through the palm placement, through Moretti's collapse to the floor. The breath came out of his nose, slowly, without sound, and his chest dropped by the 1.5 inches that Moretti's had risen at the start of the second punch. Bruce inhaled once. Then he spoke. He said 3 sentences. This is the global payoff of the story. I am going to tell you what he said, but I need to set up the geometry of the moment correctly first, because the words have to land in the right physical context or they will not mean what they meant in the corridor. Bruce is standing. The briefcase is in his right hand. His feet are at shoulder width. His weight is centered. He has just exhaled for the first time in approximately 40 seconds. Moretti is on his back. His head is on the concrete. His right hand is on his stomach. His eyes are on Bruce. He has not yet tried to sit up. The fluorescent light is flickering. Bruce shifts the briefcase 1 inch in his right hand. He does not transfer it. He shifts it. He raises his left hand, the empty hand, the hand that has been at his side the entire 11 minutes, and he extends his index finger, and he points at the floor. He does not point at Moretti. He points at the floor next to Moretti's right hip. This is the gesture every version of the story reports, in slightly different language, and it is the gesture Henry Park did not see from the mop, because Henry Park was 40 feet away around a corner. But Moretti reported it, and Taky reported it from Bruce, and a third version reported it too, the third version we have not yet talked about, which is the version Bruce's senior student in Los Angeles wrote down in a notebook 3 days later when Bruce told him a short version of the story over lunch. The senior student's notebook is in the archive of a martial arts school in Burbank, California, and the page is dated October 27, 1967, and the page describes, in 12 lines, what Bruce told the student about the corridor, and the 12th line says, "He pointed at the floor." He didn't point at me. He pointed at the floor. The senior student wrote the word me because Bruce, telling the story over lunch, had said me, meaning he had used me as the placeholder for Moretti when reenacting the gesture. The senior student transcribed the placeholder. The senior student knew Bruce was not talking about himself. The page is clear about that from context. Bruce pointed at the floor. He said, "This is where you are." He paused. Moretti, on his back, did not move. Bruce moved the pointing finger. He shifted the point about 2 feet to the left, to a spot on the floor closer to the wall. He said, "This is where you were standing before." He paused again. He shifted the point one more time, back to where it had started, next to Moretti's right hip. He said, "If you get up and you go back to where you were, this is going to happen again. If you get up and you walk out, this never happened." 3 sentences. 28 words. That was the payoff. Moretti, in the hotel bar in 1973, said, "I had expected him to say something about karate. I had expected him to say something about my style. I had expected him to say something about what he had done. He didn't say anything about any of it. He gave me a map." The man with the notebook asked, "A map of what?" Moretti said, "A map of the 2 doors out of the corridor." He showed me which one each one was. The man with the notebook asked, "Did you understand it then?" Moretti said, "I understood it as soon as he said it. I didn't understand it for years." Moretti lay on the floor for about 10 more seconds. Then he sat up. Bruce did not help him. Bruce did not extend a hand. Bruce did not step back either. He stood where he had been standing, with the briefcase in his right hand and his weight centered, and he watched Moretti sit up the way a doctor would watch a patient sit up, paying attention to the way the body moved, to whether anything was broken, to whether the sit was happening on its own or whether there was going to need to be help. The sit was happening on its own. Moretti rolled onto his right hip, brought his left hand to the floor, pushed up to a seated position. He did not stand immediately. He sat for about 5 seconds, with his knees up and his hands on his knees and his head down, and he breathed. He had not breathed properly since before the second punch. He breathed now. 3 breaths. Long ones. On the 4th breath he stood. He stood slowly. Not because his body was damaged. Bruce's placement had transmitted force through the sternum in a way that produced a bruise the size of a coffee saucer over the next 48 hours, but had not broken any ribs and had not damaged any internal organs and had not, in any technical sense, hurt him, but because the part of him that was telling his body to stand was operating on a different timetable from the part of him that was processing what had just happened. He stood. He looked at Bruce. Bruce was looking back at him with the same face. Moretti's right hand, the right hand whose middle, ring, and small fingers stopped about halfway when they tried to close, because Moretti had broken those 3 fingers in a tournament in 1964 and they had healed badly and he had been compensating ever since. That right hand came up to his sternum, and the fingers touched the spot where the palm had landed, and Moretti pressed the spot, gently, the way a man checks a bruise that hasn't fully formed yet. He winced. The wince was the first expression that had crossed his face since he had stood up from the plastic chair 42 minutes earlier in the terminal. Bruce saw the wince. Bruce, without changing his face, nodded once. It was the same nod he had given Henry Park on the way out of the corridor, which had not happened yet. Bruce had not walked out yet, but which would happen in about 90 seconds. The same nod. The nod of a man who has registered another man and who is signaling, with the smallest possible gesture, that the registration has happened. Moretti returned the nod. He did not bow. He did not speak. He nodded back once, and his hand came down from his sternum. Then he turned. He walked toward the mouth of the corridor, the same direction he had walked in from, and he did not look back at Bruce, and he did not look at the flickering fluorescent light, and he did not look at Henry Park's mop bucket, which was sitting where Henry Park had left it when Henry Park had gone to wring out the mop in the utility room, and he walked the full length of the corridor, and he came out into the terminal, and he turned left toward the main concourse, and he walked out of the gate. Area. Bruce did not walk out for 90 seconds. He stayed in the corridor. This is something I have wondered about for 40 years, and I'm going to tell you the only piece of evidence I have about what he did in those 90 seconds, because the piece of evidence is small, but it is the only piece. Henry Park, on the bench in 1982, told my uncle, after the big one came out, the small one didn't come out for a while. I thought maybe something had happened. I thought maybe the big one had hit him on the way out and he was down. I was about to go look. Then I heard him. My uncle asked, "Heard him doing what?" Henry Park said, "He was praying." Or something like praying. I don't know what religion. He was saying something in a language I didn't know. Quiet. Just words. Not loud. My uncle asked, "How long?" Henry Park said, "Maybe 30 seconds. Then he stopped. Then he came out. I do not know what Bruce was saying in the corridor. I do not know what language Henry Park heard. Bruce spoke Cantonese, English, and some Mandarin, and Henry Park spoke Korean and English, and any of the three languages Bruce spoke would have been unfamiliar to Henry Park. The words could have been Cantonese. They could have been a passage from something Bruce had been reading. They could have been a name. I have my guesses. My guesses are not worth your time. What I can tell you is that Bruce walked out of the corridor at approximately 5:13 in the morning. And he nodded at Henry Park as he passed the mop bucket, and he sat down in the same plastic chair he had been sitting in 12 minutes earlier, and he unfolded the newspaper, and he found the paragraph about the man in Indonesia who had lost his farm in a flood, and he kept reading. He read for 38 minutes. His flight to Los Angeles boarded at 5:51. He boarded with the rest of the passengers. He sat in seat 14C. He did not speak to the person in 14B. He set the briefcase under the seat in front of him. He took the letter out of the briefcase before he set the briefcase down. He held the letter, unopened, in his lap, for the entire flight. He did not read it. Hold that. He did not read it. The letter sat in his lap, in a plain white envelope, for the entire 1 hour and 11-minute flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The envelope was unsealed. Bruce had opened it 3 weeks earlier, in his kitchen on College Street, the day it had arrived from Hong Kong, but the letter inside was folded into thirds, and Bruce did not unfold it on the plane, and he did not look at it, and he did not. According to the woman who was sitting in seat 14B and who told a version of this to a reporter for a Chinese language paper in San Francisco in 1974 when she recognized Bruce's face in a movie poster and realized who she had been sitting next to, do anything with the letter except hold it. She said he held it with both hands. She said the briefcase was under the seat in front of him. She said he did not eat the small breakfast the flight attendant brought. She said he drank 1 cup of tea. She said when the plane landed at LAX, he folded the letter one more time into sixths, and he put it into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, and he picked up the briefcase, and he walked off the plane. The woman in 14B never spoke to him during the flight. She said in 1974, I thought he was a man going to a funeral. He was not going to a funeral. He was going to a meeting. The meeting was at a restaurant in Chinatown in Los Angeles at 11 o'clock that morning, with a man whose name I'm going to give you now because it matters and because the man has been dead since 1991 and because his family, when I wrote to them in 2019, asked me to use the name if I ever told this story. The man's name was Wang Shunliang. He was not in Los Angeles that morning. He was in Hong Kong. This is the second of the 2 details where the 3 versions of the story do not match. And it is the place where I am going to stop the forward motion of the story for about 3 minutes and tell you what the disagreement is, because the disagreement is not a small one and I owe it to you to walk through it. Taky's version, on the kitchen table in 1986, was that Bruce was flying to Los Angeles to show the letter from Yip Man to one of Yip Man's other senior students who was visiting Los Angeles that week. Taky did not know the senior student's name. Bruce had not told him the name on the phone in 1967. Taky reported that Bruce had said, I'm going to show it to one of the older brothers. He's in LA this week. Moretti's version, in the hotel bar in 1973, did not include the letter at all. Moretti did not know there was a letter. Moretti did not know there was a briefcase that mattered beyond the fact that Bruce had hit him with the hand it was in. Moretti's version stopped at the corridor. The senior student's notebook in Burbank, the page dated October 27, 1967, said this, in the 11th line, he said he was carrying a letter from his teacher. He said the letter had told him to stop teaching foreigners. He said he had not decided yet what to do. You see the problem. Taky's version says Bruce was flying to Los Angeles to show the letter to someone in Los Angeles. The senior student's version says Bruce was carrying the letter to Los Angeles because Bruce lived in Los Angeles and the letter had been mailed to his Los Angeles address and he had been in San Francisco for a weekend and was simply flying home with it. These are not the same story. I sat with this disagreement for about 2 years before I figured out what to do with it. I went back to Taky in 1990, when Taky was still alive, and I asked him directly. Taky said, "I told your father what Bruce told me." Bruce said he was going to show it to one of the older brothers. I don't know what Bruce did with it after. I went to the senior student's notebook. The senior student himself died in 1989, but his son, who runs the school in Burbank, let me read the notebook in 2003, and the 11th line is what it is. The senior student wrote down that Bruce said the letter had told him to stop teaching foreigners and that Bruce had not decided what to do. The two versions are not necessarily in conflict. It is possible that Bruce was carrying the letter home to Los Angeles, and that he had also arranged, separately, to meet with one of Yip Man's senior students who happened to be in Los Angeles that week, and that the meeting was about the letter, and that Taky knew about the meeting and the senior student in Burbank did not. It is also possible that there was no meeting and Taky was filling in a detail that was not there. It is also possible that the senior student in Burbank was a meeting Bruce did not tell Taky about. I don't know. I am telling you I don't know. What I do know is that Yip Man did write the letter, and the letter did say what the senior student's notebook says it said, and Bruce did carry it on the plane on October 24, 1967, and Bruce did not read it on the plane, and Bruce did not, in the next 6 years of his life, fully act on it. He did not stop teaching foreigners. He continued teaching foreigners until the day he died. But he also, starting in November of 1967, began closing the schools. He closed the Oakland school first, in November. He closed the Los Angeles school in early 1968, the College Street school, where the slap had happened, where the woman against the wall had stood with her hands at her sides. He stopped taking new students in Seattle in 1969, and Taky began running the Seattle program as something other than a Bruce Lee school, with Bruce's approval. By 1970, Bruce was teaching privately, in small numbers, in his home in Los Angeles, to a circle of about 11 students. 11. The same number as the tournaments Frank Moretti had won in the 18 months before the morning in the corridor. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's meaningful. I think it's the number that happened to be in Bruce's house at the time, and I am only telling you because the parallel struck me when I was building the chronology, and I want you to know it struck me, and I don't want you to think it means more than it does. The letter from Yip Man did not tell Bruce to stop teaching foreigners outright. I have read the letter. The letter is at a private collection in San Francisco. The collector, who was the grandson of a man Bruce trained with in Hong Kong in 1958, allowed me to read it in 2011 in his apartment, with him sitting across the table, and he did not allow me to photograph it or transcribe it, but he let me read it twice, slowly, in the original Cantonese, with him watching. The letter is 1 page. It is dated September 14, 1967. It is written in Yip Man's hand, which I have compared to other examples and which I am satisfied is his. The letter does not say, "Stop teaching foreigners." The letter says, and I am paraphrasing, because I am not allowed to quote, the letter says that Yip Man has heard about Bruce's schools in America, and has heard about the students Bruce has taken, and has heard about the demonstrations Bruce has been giving at tournaments, and has heard about the things Bruce has been saying about traditional martial arts in interviews, and has heard, also, About the things that have been happening around Bruce, the challenges, the men who come looking, the woman in San Francisco, a name I will not give you here, who had appeared at Bruce's school in 1966 with a knife, and that Yip Man is concerned, not about Bruce's ability to handle these things, because Yip Man trusts Bruce's ability, but about what the things are doing to Bruce. The letter says, in the last paragraph, and I am paraphrasing this part very carefully, because the last paragraph is the part the senior student's notebook compressed into "Stop Teaching Foreigners," and the compression is, I think, not quite right. The last paragraph says, approximately, a teacher who is also a target cannot fully be a teacher. You must choose. If you continue as you are, the targets will continue to find you, and one of them, eventually, will be a target you do not see coming. You are skilled enough to survive most of them. You are not skilled enough to survive all of them. Choose what you want to be. Be that. That is the letter. Bruce carried it from San Francisco to Los Angeles on October 24, 1967, unopened in his lap, having read it 3 weeks earlier in his kitchen, having not yet decided what it meant for him, having met Frank Moretti in a corridor 8 hours before the flight, having shown Frank Moretti in approximately 4 seconds that he was still skilled enough to survive the targets, and having sat in seat 14C holding the letter without rereading it because he did not need to reread it. He needed to sit with it. He sat with it for 1 hour and 11 minutes. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and walked off the plane. What he decided, in the next 6 years, was a compromise. He did not stop teaching foreigners. He stopped being available as a target. The schools closed. The tournaments stopped. The demonstrations slowed. The number of students dropped from approximately 70 in 1967 to approximately 11 in 1970. The public face of Bruce Lee, in those 3 years, went underground in a way that confused everyone who had been watching him in the karate world, and that did not become legible until 1971, when he started making movies in Hong Kong and the public face came back in a completely different form, a form in which the targets could not find him, because the form was a screen, and you cannot challenge a man on a screen to a fight in a corridor. I think the letter is why. I cannot prove it. I think the corridor is why too. I think the morning of October 24, 1967, was the morning Bruce understood, in his body, what Yip Man had told him in the letter 3 weeks earlier. I think the corridor was the 1/8 of a second example of the thing Yip Man had been describing. The target Bruce had not seen coming was not Frank Moretti, who Bruce had seen coming for 4 months. The target Bruce had not seen coming was the next Frank Moretti, and the next one, and the one after that, and the way they would keep coming, and the way one of them, eventually, would be at 5 in the morning in a corridor where there were no witnesses except a cleaner with a mop, and the way one of them, eventually, would not give Bruce the 1/8 of a second. I think Bruce understood, walking off that plane in Los Angeles, that he was going to have to stop being the man who could be met in corridors. I think he chose what to be. I think he became it. But I want to be honest with you that I am theorizing here, and that the theory is built on a letter I read once, in 2011, in another man's apartment, and a story I have been carrying since I was a child, and that the connection between the two, between the letter and the corridor, is a connection I am making, not a connection any of the 4 sources I have used made for me. Taky did not make the connection. Moretti did not know there was a letter. Henry Park did not know there was a Yip Man. The senior student in Burbank wrote down both facts on the same page but did not connect them in his notebook. The connection is mine. I am offering it to you as mine. You can take it or you can leave it. Now I want to come back to Frank Moretti. Because I told you, at the end of part 1, that on the morning of January 31st, 1968, 6 weeks and 3 days after the corridor, Frank Moretti walked into his instructor's office in San Jose at 7 a.m. with a cup of coffee he was not drinking, and he sat down across from his instructor, and he said 3 sentences, and the instructor wrote them down, and the instructor's son still has the page. I am going to tell you what the 3 sentences said. I want to give you the context first. Briefly, because the sentences without context are smaller than they were. In the 6 weeks between the corridor and the morning in the office, Frank Moretti had done the following things. He had flown home from San Francisco on the morning of October 24, 1967, on the 8:15 flight, 3 flights after Bruce's. He had not gone to work that day. He had driven from the San Jose airport to his house. He had told his wife he was not feeling well. He had gone into the garage, where he kept his heavy bag, and he had stood in front of the heavy bag for about 40 minutes without hitting it. He had then gone into the house and slept for 14 hours. He had returned to work on October 26th. He had not gone to the dojo for the rest of October. In November, he had gone to the dojo 3 times. On all 3 occasions, he had warmed up, stretched, watched the other students spar, and left without sparring himself. His instructor had not asked him why. His instructor had registered the change and had decided to wait. In early December, Moretti had withdrawn from a tournament in Sacramento he had been scheduled to fight in. He had told the organizers he had a shoulder injury. He did not have a shoulder injury. In mid-December, he had begun coming to the dojo more regularly, and he had begun sparring again, and the students who sparred with him reported to each other, not to him, that something was different. He was still fast. He was still strong. He was still landing his reverse punch. But he was, in a way that was hard to articulate, not committing to the punch the way he had committed to it before. The punch was landing. The follow-through was not. He was pulling something at the moment of contact, not the strike itself, but something behind the strike, some piece of weight or intention that he had previously put into every punch and that he was now, visibly, holding back. On January 14, 1968, in a sparring match with a brown belt at the San Jose dojo, Moretti had thrown a reverse punch, had landed it clean on the brown belt's chest pad, and had then stopped sparring. He had bowed out. He had walked off the floor. He had not sparred again that day. He had come back to the dojo 3 more times before January 31st, but he had not sparred again at all. On the morning of January 31st, 1968, Moretti got up at 5:30 in the morning, the way he always did. He made coffee. He did not drink it. He drove to the dojo. He arrived at 6:45. He waited in the parking lot until 7, because the instructor came in at 7 and Moretti did not want to be there before the instructor was. At 7, the instructor's car pulled in. The instructor, whose name I am not using, for the reasons I gave you earlier, got out, saw Moretti's car, did not show surprise, walked into the dojo, unlocked his office, and waited. Moretti came in 2 minutes later. He sat down across from the instructor. He held the cup of coffee with both hands. He said 3 sentences. The instructor, who had been keeping a journal in Japanese since he had emigrated from Osaka in 1954, wrote them down that night, in Japanese, in the journal. The journal is now in the possession of the instructor's son, who let me read the rel I would like to keep training. I would like to ask if you will continue to teach me. The instructor wrote down, after the 3 sentences, his own response. The instructor's response, translated, is 1 sentence. The instructor said, yes. That was the meeting. Moretti stayed at the dojo for another 19 years. He never competed again. He stopped attending tournaments altogether. He continued training 3 or 4 mornings a week until 1987, when his shoulder finally gave out for reasons that had nothing to do with the corridor and everything to do with being 51 years old and having thrown approximately 150,000 reverse punches over the course of a lifetime. He died of a heart attack in 1998 at the age of 62. His daughter, who had been 4 years old on the morning of October 24, 1967, was 35 when he died. I have not spoken to her. I wrote to her in 2019. At the same time I wrote to Wang Xunliang's family in Hong Kong, and she wrote back, briefly, that she knew the story about her father in the corridor and that she did not want it to be the main thing anyone remembered about him, and that if I told it I should tell it knowing that he had been, for the 31 years between the corridor and his death, a quiet man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle and how to balance a checkbook and how to ask a question and wait for the answer, instead of guessing at it. She asked me to put that in. I am putting it in. Frank Moretti was a quiet man who taught his daughter how to ride a bicycle. He had also been, on one morning in October 1967, the man who had crossed a terminal in 12 strides to find out if a thing was real, and he had found out, and the finding out had changed him, and the change had not destroyed him. The change had made him into a different man who lived for 31 more years and who did not become bitter and who did not, as far as his daughter knows, ever tell her the story of the corridor. He told one man in a hotel bar in Las Vegas in 1973, and the man wrote it down, and the man kept the promise not to use Moretti's name, and the man died in 2004 with the notebook in a drawer in his house in Reno, and the man's widow gave the notebook to me in 2015 because she had read something I had written and she had decided I was the person to give it to. I have the notebook. It is in the same drawer as the gas station receipt. The receipt has 3 sentences on it. The receipt is the last piece of this. I am going to tell you, in the last part, what the 3 sentences on the receipt say. But before I do, there is one more person whose version I have not finished giving you. Henry Park. You remember Henry Park? The cleaner. The Korean man, 48 years old that morning, who had been working at SFO since 1955, who had registered the shape of what was happening when Bruce and Moretti walked past him toward the corridor, who had heard Bruce praying or doing something like praying in a language he didn't know, who had received Bruce's nod on the way out and who had returned to his mop. Henry Park kept mopping for another 6 years. He retired from the airport in 1973. He moved, with his wife, to a small house in the Richmond district of San Francisco, 3 blocks off Geary Boulevard, and he lived there for the rest of his life. He died in 1996. In the 23 years between his retirement and his death, Henry Park told the story of what he had seen in the terminal exactly once. He told it on a bench outside a coffee shop on Geary Boulevard, in the spring of 1982, to a stranger. The stranger was my uncle. My uncle was in San Francisco for a wedding. He was sitting on the bench because he had walked 3 miles from the wedding venue to clear his head and his feet hurt, and he had bought a coffee and he had sat down. Henry Park had been sitting on the bench already. They had not spoken for the first 20 minutes. Then my uncle, who knew almost nothing about Bruce Lee except what his brother, my father, had been telling him for 15 years over Christmas dinner, had taken out a small paperback book he had bought at the airport. The book was a biography of Bruce Lee. It was not a good biography. My uncle was reading it on the plane and had brought it with him because he had not finished it yet. Henry Park had seen the cover. The cover had a photograph of Bruce Lee on it. Henry Park had said, in English, without preamble, "I saw him once." My uncle had looked up. Henry Park had said, I saw him in the airport. I saw him do a thing. That was how the conversation started. It lasted about an hour. Henry Park, on that bench, told my uncle the version of the story I have been giving you in pieces, the version from the cleaner's vantage point, 40 feet away around a corner, with the mop and the bucket and the flickering light he had been trying for 3 weeks to get the maintenance order through on. He told my uncle about the footsteps. He told my uncle about the briefcase. He told my uncle about the nod on the way out. He told my uncle about the praying. He told my uncle one more thing. He told my uncle that he had seen Bruce 2 more times in the next year. This is the part of Henry Park's version that I have been holding back, because it is the part that makes the rest of it land, and I needed the rest of it to be in place before I told you. Bruce came back to SFO twice in 1968. The first time was in March. The second time was in August. Both times, Bruce was on layovers, Los Angeles to Seattle, or Los Angeles to Oakland, I'm not sure which way, and both times, Bruce passed through the same gate concourse where the corridor was. Both times, Bruce stopped at Henry Park's mop bucket. Both times, Bruce did not speak. The first time, in March, Bruce nodded at Henry Park and Henry Park nodded back, and Bruce walked on. The second time, in August, Bruce stopped longer. Bruce stopped, and he looked at Henry Park, and he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where he had carried the folded letter on the morning of October 24, 1967, and he took out a folded piece of paper, and he handed it to Henry Park. He did not speak. He nodded again. He walked on. Henry Park put the paper in his pocket. He did not open it until his shift ended that night. He opened it in his car, in the parking lot, under the dome light. The paper had one sentence written on it, in English, in Bruce's handwriting. Henry Park kept the paper for the rest of his life. His widow gave it to my uncle in 1997, the year after Henry Park died, because she remembered my uncle from the bench and because Henry Park had told her, several times in the last years of his life, that if anyone ever came asking about the small Chinese man at the airport, she should give them the paper. My uncle gave it to my father in 1998. My father put it in the drawer. The paper is in the drawer right now. It is the third item in the drawer, along with the gas station receipt and the notebook from the hotel bar in Las Vegas. I am going to tell you what the sentence on the paper says. I am going to tell you what the 3 sentences on the receipt say. I am going to tell you, last, what I think the corridor was for, not for Bruce, who I have been theorizing about for 40 years and who has earned the right to keep some of his own reasons, but for the rest of us, who inherited the story through a chain of 4 people who did not know each other and who each kept a small piece of paper in a drawer for the second half of their lives because they understood, in a way they could not have articulated, that the story would need a place to land. The drawer is the place. The papers are the landing. The last part is next. The drawer is in a desk in the front room of a house in Los Angeles, 50 miles south of where Taky sat in his kitchen in 1986 with his hands flat on the wood. The desk belonged to my father. The house is the house I grew up in. The drawer is the second drawer on the right side of the desk, and it has, in it, 3 items, and I am going to describe them to you in the order they entered the drawer, because the order matters. The first item is the gas station receipt. The receipt is from a Shell station in Bakersfield, dated April 13, 1986. My father bought $7.20 worth of regular gasoline on his drive back from Seattle. He bought a cup of coffee for 40 cents. The total on the receipt is $7.60. The receipt is about 3.5 inches wide and about 4 inches long, printed on the thin yellow paper that gas stations used in the 80s, and the back of the receipt is blank except for 3 sentences in my father's handwriting in black ballpoint pen. The handwriting is small. It is small because my father wrote small when he was writing things he did not want to forget. He wrote large when he was writing things that were already in his head. The smallness of the handwriting on the receipt is the first thing I noticed when I took the receipt out of the drawer in 1998, after my father died, and held it under the desk lamp to read what was on the back. I am going to give you the 3 sentences now. I am going to give them to you exactly as my father wrote them, with his line breaks and his punctuation. Because the line breaks and the punctuation are part of the thing. The first sentence is, Taky said B said, I move on the 8th of a second. The second sentence is, Taky said B said, I can teach the 8th of a second, I can't teach the 9 years. The third sentence is, Taky said B said, the corridor wasn't the lesson. The corridor was the bill. That is the receipt. 3 sentences on the back of a gas station receipt from Bakersfield, written by my father on April 14, 1986, the morning after he came home from Seattle, while the coffee from the percolator was still in his mouth and the 3 sentences were still close enough to the surface that he could put them down without losing the shape of them. The corridor was the bill. I want to sit with that for a moment, because the third sentence is the one that has been doing work in my head for the 30 years I have had the drawer in my possession, and I want to give you the work it has been doing, and then I want to give it back to you to do your own work with. A bill, in the sense Taky was using it, and Taky was reporting what Bruce had said, on the phone the night of October 24, 1967, 8 hours after the corridor. A bill is what comes after a meal. The meal happens first. The meal is the thing. The bill is the consequence of the thing. You do not eat the bill. You do not order the bill. The bill arrives because the meal happened, and the bill has to be paid because the meal was real. Bruce was saying, on the phone to Taky, that the corridor was not the meal. The meal had been the 9 years. The meal had been every morning between 1958 and 1967 that Bruce had spent in a garage or a back room or a yard, working on something he could not yet do, alone, before anyone was watching, while the rest of the people who would later have opinions about him were still asleep. The meal had been the choice, made in 1958 in a small apartment in Hong Kong, to start training under Yip Man et al. The meal had been the choice, made in 1964 in Oakland, to keep going after Wong Jack Man, to not stop, to not be satisfied with what he already had, to look at what he had done in that fight and to decide that it had not been enough. The meal had been the choice, made in 1965 and 1966 and through the early months of 1967, to keep refining a thing that did not yet have a name and that other people kept telling him would not work and that he had to build, line by line, without a teacher in the room to confirm whether the line he had just built was the right line. The meal had been 9 years of choices, most of them made when no one was looking, none of them visible from the outside, all of them paid for in time and attention and the willingness to be wrong for as long as it took to stop being wrong. The corridor was the bill. The bill was 4 seconds long. The bill was paid in 4 seconds because 9 years had been spent at the table. And Bruce, on the phone to Taky that night, was telling Taky in a sentence I think Taky understood immediately, because Taky had been at the table next to Bruce for several of those years, that what Moretti had walked into in the corridor was not a fight. It was an invoice. Moretti had not been beaten by a technique. He had been beaten by an accumulation. The technique, the diagonal step, the hip turn, the open palm, the 1/8 of a second was the line on the bill. The accumulation was the meal. And Moretti, who was a skilled fighter who had won 11 tournaments in 18 months and who had been training in Shotokan since he was 15, had walked into the corridor expecting to face a technique, and he had instead faced an accumulation, and there is no defense, in any martial art, against an accumulation. You cannot block a meal you did not eat. That is the receipt. That is the first item in the drawer. The second item is the notebook from the hotel bar in Las Vegas. The notebook is a small spiral-bound notebook, about 4 inches by 6, with a brown cover. It belonged to a man whose name I am not going to use because his widow asked me not to. He was a writer for a martial arts magazine. He was in Las Vegas in March of 1973 for a tournament that Moretti had been invited to as a referee. And he had recognized Moretti at the tournament, and he had bought Moretti a drink at the hotel bar, and Moretti had talked to him for about 3 hours. The notebook contains 41 pages of notes from that conversation. I have read all 41 pages. I have already given you the parts of the notebook that mattered for the story of the corridor. I have given you the part where Moretti said he had me on the first miss, he didn't take the shot. I have given you the part where Moretti said I had never thrown a punch into empty air before. I have given you the part where Moretti said it was like he had been in 2 places, not moved between them, been in them. I have not given you the last page. The last page of the notebook is the part of the conversation where Moretti was about to leave the bar. The writer had paid the tab. They had stood up. The writer had asked Moretti one last question, almost as a formality, as the kind of question you ask when you are about to part with a man who has just told you the most important story he has ever told anyone. The writer asked, "Do you regret going to find him?" Moretti, according to the notebook, paused for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "No." The writer asked, "Why not?" Moretti said one sentence. The writer wrote it down on the last page of the notebook, in slightly larger handwriting than the rest of the notes, with a circle drawn around it. Moretti said, "Because before the corridor I thought I knew what I was building. After the corridor I knew I had been building the wrong thing. He gave me 30 more years of building the right thing. Most men don't get that. Most men don't ever find out they were building the wrong thing." That is the last page of the notebook. That is the second item in the drawer. The third item is the paper Bruce handed to Henry Park in August of 1968. The paper is small. It is about 2 inches by 3 inches, torn from what looks like a larger notepad, the kind of small spiral pad people carried in their shirt pockets in the 60s. It has been folded twice. The folds are sharp. Henry Park kept it folded in his wallet for 28 years, and when his widow gave it to my uncle in 1997 it was still folded the same way. I unfolded it once, in 2003, to verify the contents. I have not unfolded it since. The paper has one sentence on it, in Bruce's handwriting, in blue ink. The handwriting is small and slightly slanted. The sentence is short. The sentence is, "You were the only one who didn't pretend not to see." That is the third item. That is the whole drawer. A receipt with 3 sentences on the back. A notebook with 1 sentence on the last page. A folded piece of paper with 1 sentence on it. 3 pieces of paper. 5 sentences. 5 sentences across 19 years, written down by 3 different men in 3 different cities, none of whom knew about the other 2, none of whom intended to be part of a chain, all of whom, when the moment came to write something down, wrote something down because they understood, in a way they could not have articulated, that what they had heard was going to need a place to wait. The drawer is the place. The papers are the weight. And I am, as far as I can tell, the first person who has ever had all 3 pieces of paper in the same room at the same time and who has sat down and put them next to each other and asked what the 5 sentences, together, are saying. I want to give you what I think they are saying. I want to be very careful about how I give it to you, because I have been theorizing for the last 40 minutes of this video and I have used up most of the credit you have extended me to do that, and I want to spend the last of it carefully. I think the 5 sentences, together, are about 3 things. The first thing is the 1/8 of a second. This is the technical thing. This is the thing the receipt is about. Bruce found, after 9 years, a window 1/8 of a second wide, located on the front edge of the exhale, during the breath cycle of a committed attacker, in which he could move without being seen. He could only move within the window. The window was the discovery. The 9 years had been the work of finding the window. Most of what we call mastery, in any field, is a window like this. It is a small specific moment, in a specific cycle, in which a thing can be done that cannot be done at any other moment in the cycle. The mastery is the having found the window. The mastery is also the willingness to spend years not finding it. The mastery is also the patience to keep working in the dark while you are not finding it. The mastery is also the discipline to keep your hand on the dial when you do find it and not to overcorrect and lose it again. The window is small. The 9 years are large. The ratio is the bill. The second thing is what Moretti said on the last page of the notebook. He gave me 30 more years of building the right thing. This is the thing I find hardest to talk about, because it is the thing the story is most often used for, badly, in motivational versions of Bruce Lee that you can find in any bookstore. The thing where the great teacher humbles the lesser man and the lesser man, having been humbled, finds the better path. The version where the corridor is a redemption story. I do not think the corridor was a redemption story. I think Moretti redeemed himself. I think Bruce showed him a fact, and the fact was painful, and Moretti could have done with the fact what most men do with painful facts, which is to file the fact in the part of the mind where it cannot interfere with the life that has been built around its absence. Moretti did not do that. Moretti took the fact home with him. Moretti looked at the fact for 6 weeks in a row, in a garage, in front of a heavy bag he was not hitting. Moretti walked into his instructor's office on January 31, 1968, and said 3 sentences that ended his career, and then he kept training for 19 more years without competing, and he raised a daughter, and he taught her to ride a bicycle, and he died at 62 of a heart attack, and his daughter wrote to me in 2019 and asked me to make sure I said he had been a quiet man. Bruce did not do that. Bruce gave him the fact. The fact was a gift. But what Moretti did with the gift was Moretti's own work. And I think the reason Bruce, in the corridor, did not strike on the first opening, the reason he gave Moretti the chance to stop, the reason he pointed at the floor and said, "This is where you are, this is where you were, if you get up and go back this happens again, if you get up and walk out this never happened," is that Bruce understood the difference between the fact and the work. He could give the fact. He could not do the work for the man receiving the fact. He could only show the man the map of the 2 doors and let the man choose which door to walk through. Moretti walked through the door Bruce did not name. He walked out, and he walked back to his life, and he built a different life on top of the rubble of the life he had thought he was building. He had 30 years to do it. He used the time. That was not Bruce's gift. That was Moretti's response to the gift. The story of the corridor is not the story of what Bruce did to Moretti. It is the story of what Moretti did with what Bruce did to him. That is the second thing. The third thing is the sentence on Henry Park's paper. You were the only one who didn't pretend not to see. Bruce gave Henry Park this sentence in August of 1968, 10 months after the corridor. He came back to SFO. He stopped at the mop bucket. He handed Henry Park a folded piece of paper, and he nodded, and he walked on. I want to tell you why I think Bruce wrote that sentence. There were 9 people in the terminal at 5 in the morning on October 24, 1967. 8 of them were asleep or pretending to be asleep. 1 of them was awake. The one who was awake was running a mop in long slow arcs across the tile, and when the footsteps changed, he looked up. He did not look up for long. He did not stare. He did not interfere. He looked up because the change in the footsteps had registered in the part of him that had been working night shifts in airports for 22 years, and he looked up because that part of him was always paying attention. And he looked up because not looking up, looking down, looking away, looking through would have been a betrayal of the part of him that knew what footsteps sounded like. He looked up. He saw the 2 men walk past. He saw the small one's briefcase. He registered that something was about to happen that he could not stop and that he was not going to try to stop, and he did the only thing he could do, which was to see it. He saw it. He went back to mopping. He saw the small one come back alone. He saw the big one come back 90 seconds later. He saw the small one return to his chair and open the paper. He heard the praying or what sounded like praying. He received the nod. And Bruce, 10 months later, came back to find him and gave him a sentence. You were the only one who didn't pretend not to see. I think Bruce understood something about Henry Park that I want to give you in the last minute of this video, as the thing I have been building toward for 40 minutes, because it is the thing I think the corridor was finally about. There were 9 people in the terminal. 8 of them did not see. 1 of them did. And the one who did was not the one who knew karate. The one who saw was not the one who had spent 9 years finding the 1/8 of a second. The one who saw was the one who had spent 22 years pushing a mop on the night shift at SFO, and who had developed, in those 22 years, the only skill that mattered in the corridor on the morning of October 24, 1967, which was the skill of not looking away when something real was happening. Bruce had the 1/8 of a second. Henry had the looking. And Bruce, who knew the difference between his thing and Henry's thing, came back 10 months later to tell Henry that Henry's thing was the rarer one. Most people, in most rooms, pretend not to see. They pretend not to see the man who has crossed the terminal in 12 strides. They pretend not to see the woman against the wall with her hands at her sides. They pretend not to see the small folded piece of paper and 1 sentence and a nod. That is the thing I want to leave you with. Not the 1/8 of a second. Not the 4 seconds in the corridor. Not the 3 sentences in the office in San Jose, or the 5 sentences across 19 years, or the receipt or the notebook or the folded paper in the drawer. The looking. The not pretending not to see. The willingness to register a thing when it happens, in front of you, in a room you are in, even if you cannot stop it, even if your job is to keep mopping, even if the only thing you can do is be the one person in the room who, when the story comes around to be told 15 years later on a bench outside a coffee shop, can tell it because you saw it. Bruce spent 9 years finding the 1/8 of a second. Henry spent 22 years finding the willingness to look up. I do not know which of the 2 is harder. I suspect they are the same difficulty, in different forms, and I suspect that the corridor on the morning of October 24, 1967, was the only moment in either man's life when both forms were in the same room at the same time, and I suspect that is why Bruce came back 10 months later with a piece of paper. He came back because the room had been real. He came back because Henry had been the witness that made it real. He came back because the story needed Henry, in a way it did not need anyone else, to survive long enough to be told. And here, at the end of 40 minutes, I am telling it to you because Henry told my uncle, and my uncle told my father, and my father wrote 3 sentences on the back of a gas station receipt in 1986, and a man in Las Vegas wrote 41 pages in a notebook in 1973, and Henry's widow gave a folded piece of paper to my uncle in 1997, and all three pieces of paper ended up in the same drawer in the same desk in the same house in Los Angeles in 1998, and I have been sitting with them, on and off, for 27 years. I am not the last link in the chain. You are. What you do with the chain is your own work. I am only the person who put the three papers next to each other on the desk and read them in order, for the first time. The drawer is closed now. The papers are back inside. The desk is in the front room of the house I grew up in, and the house is still there, 50 miles south of where Taky sat in his kitchen in 1986 with his hands flat on the wood, and the kettle is no longer on the stove because Taky has been dead since 2010, and my father has been dead since 1998, and Frank Moretti has been dead since 1998, and Henry Park has been dead since 1996, and Bruce has been dead since 1973, and the man with the notebook has been dead since 2004, and the senior student in Burbank has been dead since 1989, and out of the 11 people who were inside this story when it was happening, the only ones still alive are the senior student's son, and Moretti's daughter, and the collector in San Francisco who has the letter, and me. 4 people. 3 pieces of paper. 1 drawer. And whatever you do, in whatever room you walk into next, with whatever footsteps you hear changing in whatever terminal you happen to be passing through, look up. That's the story.